paper, which was a briefing paper for Commonwealth Ministers of Education. But a special group of ministers from small states was created, and we had that as a platform. Now that's quite unique for researchers to be able to interact with ministers and their senior advisors. So we were using this more than that. We were listening to what those ministers and their senior advisors were saying, but we were trying to research that, document that, and also connect it to what we as researchers knew about global agendas, global priorities, the way the world was pushing all communities in education worldwide. I'm not going to make a big story about this little slide and heading because I'm not going into the details really of how to do a study. But I'm trying to get to the point when I tell you what we found out. But there's a few bullet points that give you an idea of the collective methodology and the methods that were applied. We obviously had to do literature reviews, update the Crossley and Holmes stuff, and all the other things that had been written by others. We had the face-to-face discussion with the ministers at the CCEM in 2009. But we were also, all the members of the team, we were doing other field research in small states worldwide. So we used that field research. We visited places, but when we interviewed people, it was qualitative research, at least this dimension. But if we'd already been talking with ministers and advisors, we did our very best to say, let's get to the grassroots level too. Let's go into the villages of Papua New Guinea. Let's see what the local communities think are their priorities if they live on an atoll and they're in an isolated part of a small state community, somewhere in the isolated parts of the Pacific. So we took the advantage to visit the places with real detailed field work. Solomon Islands, for instance, is different to many small states. Solomon Islands in the Pacific is one of the poorer Pacific communities with one of the larger communities, and they have some of the biggest educational problems. In fact, the Solomon Islands, as a small state, their problems are very similar to many larger states. That's quite unusual. What else did we do? We had, yes, in-depth qualitative interviews and so on, but we also were very fortunate that we had Steve Packer as part of our team. Steve Packer, I have to tell you another concept, the Unesco Education for All Global Monitoring Reports. I'm not sure if the audience knows what those are, so just give me a second to say. Ever since 1990, the global community has identified education for all goals. So it's like the global community saying, we'll agree, and they all did agree in a place called Jomtien in Thailand in 1990, that priority should be given to, in education, well, really the words were basic education. Got translated a little bit to primary schooling. But that dominated the landscape and the international development community and priorities for education and development throughout the 90s and beyond the next decade, beyond the 90s. Because that was the dominant agenda, UNESCO felt they had to monitor what was happening. So they created a specialist body to get statistics from every single system worldwide, and to put that together to say, really, every year, publish a document, are we getting towards those goals? And the target, some will know this, but the target's 2015, next year. So at the moment, the world community are busy saying, are we on target? Nigeria, are we on target? China, are we on target? Small states, are we on target? But remember, I said the targets were very often linked to basic education, primary education, schooling. Steve Packer was responsible for leading that process. So he had a team, he had all of that statistical data at his fingertips. And he carved out of the global data everything we needed for the statistics on small states. So if you want to, if out of everything else I'm saying here, the big thing you're interested in is statistics of how many kids are in school, how many teachers, how many dropouts, how many progress to tertiary education, how many tertiary institutions exist in countries. That data is built into this book. And the full data is in those global monitoring reports that are produced by Unesco every year. But again, we were fortunate. That strengthened our team. Because Professor Bray at that time and some of our other colleagues were also working in Unesco in Paris, Unesco runs one of the world's most prestigious training programs for educational planners. There'll be people from Maldives who've been through those programs. They're called the Advanced Training Programs. So educational planners from worldwide will spend time as interns based in Paris at Unesco. Very valuable program. But our colleagues on our team were leading that program. So they had another captive audience of planners. And they could spend time with them, months with them, seeing what they felt should be contributed to our analysis. So it's not dry methodology. I'm just giving you some idea of how we put our study together. So now from that, I'm going to, but what did we find out? And I've split it into 5 different slides. And here's key finding number 1, the big, big picture. Through all that sort of grassroots to ministerial sort of study. Key finding number 1. Well, the first bullet point, I won't make a big point about this one, but the work that had been done by the Commonwealth and by other international agencies supporting small state planners. There are booklets, really useful booklets. I bet we could find some in the Ministry of Education here, like, guidelines for educational planners. How to be a multifunctional administrator, where you wear lots of hats. Very typical of the situation in a small state. You have to move from one responsibility to another. And I'm sure there'll be people nodding and saying, that's what it was like in my role. That stuff is still useful. So our research was saying, keep that, keep making it available, Commonwealth reprint it and stuff. But this is where the change came. Bullet point number 2 is the big one. From ministerial level to village level, the priorities for education were related to the big changes in the world, the environmental challenges and shocks that we were facing, climate change, sea level rise. This is small state voices speaking. Secondly, there could have been the big economic shocks, the oil crises, costs of living going up, the Asian financial crisis, the Western financial crisis. When I'm visiting my friends in Hong Kong and China now, they're saying, what global economic crisis? We're booming in, they're saying it's your Western economic crisis. But those things have had shocks and implications worldwide. And what was coming out of our research is that those people responsible for education or at the front end of delivering education or receiving it were saying we need strategies, policies that are going to help us deal with these big global challenges. And that was totally different 10 years before. 10 years before, people were more concerned with management issues and how do we provide leaders for schools and specific factors. Not to say those have gone, they still remain important, but they would connect them to how do we lead our schools so that we prepare for disaster that could come from an environmental front? Or how do we rejig our training of people at the tertiary level so they can compete in a knowledge economy? Just think these things through. To compete in a knowledge economy, you need this. You need the National University of Maldives. You need tertiary education. You need training in skills. Perhaps need more vocation, to fit the modern world, though, to the challenges that you would have in the world. For SIDS, and we've got that sort of bottom slide there, it's just echoing even more, pulling this out. For SIDS, the climate change agenda, and how do we develop education that promotes and supports sustainable development. That came out as a very, very strong education for sustainability in small island developing states. So that's key finding number one. That's the big brush picture. Very often people do research in education and other social sciences, and the story they tell then is a very critical story. Oh, problems, problems, problems. Let's see what number 2. I'm going to have 5 slides. See what number 2 is. See if you can anticipate progress towards the education for all goals. Basic education for all. Is everybody in primary school in Maldives? What are our agendas? We're trying to support the whole system. What are the priorities at primary, secondary, tertiary level? Try to anticipate what might be coming. Is it across small states? Is it a bad news story? Are small states the ones that are struggling to get to the target? It's great to be able to report good news. It's a good news story if you look at the small states. If you look at the global monitoring reports worldwide, the research community are usually saying, oh, problems, we panic, we're not going to get to those global targets by 2015. What do we do? But the small state story is saying, good news, actually. If you're talking of primary schooling, we're often there. What have we said? The Millennium Development Goals, the education for all targets, they remain very relevant for small states. This is small state voices telling this. But, you know, if I'm echoing those voices are saying our pressing priorities are often beyond. They're not quite identical with the global passions and preoccupations. We've pushed further. They lie beyond those that are currently command the global attention and the attention of larger states and international development agencies. Even, you know, Unesco's, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank. Their stories, their priorities are often very different. Commonwealth small states, here's more good news, are relatively advanced in their progress towards basic education goals and targets. And small states have achieved almost universal access to basic education. That's the access. Places in schools. And I know that's the case in Maldives. Doesn't mean to say that everything's fine at the primary sector or the secondary sector, but at least access is there. And that's not the case in the bigger global community. Here's another one, the final bullet point there. Many small states have either achieved or are close to gender parity in primary and secondary schooling. You know, after the lecture, in discussions, maybe people should talk to me a little bit more about the gender balances and situation here. But in some small states, quite a lot of small states from our research, the disparity at the secondary level is in favor of girls. So it means girls are doing better. You know, the girls are the ones in school. The girls are the ones getting the higher grades. You look at the international literature on gender and education, and you'll find it's dominated by assumptions and arguments that it's girls and that are at risk. That's a challenge. I'm not saying that it's such a clear-cut story. The challenges for quality and for everybody, male or female, remain. But there is a lot to learn. Let's turn. I'm going to turn the story on its head a little bit. There's a lot that the bigger community out in the international arena can learn about gender equity, how to support girls, what priorities and what the issues may be that are challenging for boys. The Caribbean as a region, its biggest problem, gender-wise, for many decades has been boys at risk. That's the title of one of the most influential education research books published by a Caribbean author, Professor Errol Miller, in the Caribbean more than 20 years ago, Boys at Risk. So it's a gender debate, but different story coming from many small states. Remember, I did say at the beginning of this lecture, not all small states are the same. If we go to the Solomon Islands, if I could take everyone in a room with us to the Solomon Islands, we'd find it's more the traditional model. Girls are not in school. Access is the big problem. The Solomons just cannot get enough places for all their children to be in primary schooling and certainly secondary schooling. And that's more the orthodox position. But the Solomon Islands is the unusual one in the small states collection. Key finding number 3, extending the boundaries. And I would hope there's people in the room who feel, yeah, that connects to us. Because of the analysis so far, what many small states have been doing is challenging the global goals, challenging the international community, and saying, if you wish to work with us, if you want to work with our Ministry of Education, if you want to work with our university researchers, then our priorities in research or educational policy or development are these. And we're pushing the boundary a little bit. Small states were some of the very first internationally to say, okay, education for all goals, okay, Millennium Development Goals, but that means that no international agency will support work on tertiary education. When I was the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Papua New Guinea, we had visitors from the World Bank in 1988, and those visitors were saying, World Bank will not invest in tertiary education in this country. If you want people to be getting tertiary education in Papua New Guinea, send them south, send them to Australia. Primary education, basic education is the only game the bank would play. Papua New Guinea resisted. Many other small states have resisted. And they've said, our needs, our priorities are different. We do want to develop, we want to keep our primary sector strong, but we also want to develop our tertiary sector. We also want to develop our skills training. We also want to develop... So they've been pushing the boundaries. One of my research fellows, Tara Sprague, she's great with the technology and finding images. And I think that's a good image. You know, pushing the boundary, the bubble, saying, small states, that captures it. They've been saying, we have other things. We want to work with you, international community, but it's our priorities. So, what have we got there? But there's some of the first countries to shift priorities and to start talking about school effectiveness, the quality of education. Something I heard master students in this university talking about earlier today, inclusivity, inclusive policies, skills training, and higher tertiary education. And in doing that, small states have experiences. They've pushed the boundaries some of the first. So they know more about what is necessary to improve quality than many other states. They certainly know, well, take that gender story. They know more about the boys and the gender issue than they do in the UK. It's happening in the UK now. The phenomena of it's boys that are failing at school, not girls, in the UK systems. That is becoming newspaper headlines. Our research would say maybe it's time for UK researchers and policymakers to visit the Caribbean, perhaps, to see how they've been dealing with those challenges, to see what they can learn from them. Second one is therefore saying its implications for the international community. If the international community are going to support educational development, if this analysis holds, then they've to be more flexible too. They've got to give support in different ways that meet different audiences. Michael Crossley speaking here, context matters more, the contextual differences matter more than many policymakers realize. And that means international policymakers as well as local. The rise of the knowledge economy, this is global. Nations having to compete, but it's high-tech stuff. To be able to advance the technology, and for people living in archipelago communities, just think how much the mobile phone helps you to connect. You know, this thing in my pocket can probably connect with some of your atoll communities. You need to tell me if it, you know, maybe it's only Malé, maybe it's only this. Okay, so amazing how those technologies can actually break down some of the boundaries that have prevented development of education in all such shapes and forms. But it means competition and the knowledge economy, and therefore tertiary education and skills training at as high a level as possible. Get as many people from Maldives through, and today was a historic day, the first ever presentation of a doctoral proposal, research proposal in education nationwide. Harnessing of ICT and so on. Number 4, this comes to research. We did have findings. We did have small state communities at all levels saying, yes, we want more research to inform our strategies. We want it to be evidence-based. But interestingly, they were saying it's what type of research? They were saying we want research, want it locally grounded, not flying in the experts like me from the University of Bristol, for instance. I mean, I'm proud of our research group because we work with colleagues in small states. Remember I said I work with teams to strengthen their research capacity. So I'm comfortable with that. I still remain the outsider. But if we have more skills, if we have researchers that have been trained, so they're the ones calling the shots, they're the ones that can then articulate the priorities of Maldives in an international setting, and it's informed by locally grounded research. And that's why when I'm looking at dissertations and research plans and proposals from doctoral researchers and students, I'd be saying, don't just get blinded, I'll use my lens, you know, by the literature. The international literature might say, this is the model, you know, best practice. They use that word that's used a lot as if somewhere on the globe there's the best practice for school leadership, or the best practice for the practicum, or the best practice for a research model. Well, we can learn from those good practices, but we might have our own ideas what we need and what our priorities might be. So, one of our findings was saying national, regional, international partnerships, still support for that. Collaboration, yes, support for that. And let's also fight to keep the agencies that have supported the small states, the Commonwealth in particular. For the last 18 months, the Commonwealth, here's a story, it'll sound so familiar. Budget cuts. They're everywhere, budget cuts. The Commonwealth as an agency, the Commonwealth Secretariat is the civil service of the Commonwealth. The civil service of the Commonwealth has been threatened with dropping education and health. That's been the debate, and it's who has been calling those shots. Probably doesn't surprise you. I'm revealing secrets a little bit, but it's those who put the money in are trying to, the most money into the Commonwealth, are trying to save a bit in the pocket. And in doing so, they're saying, how can we cut the costs? What can we reduce? And of course, those same sort of, you can imagine the type of stakeholder I'm talking about, but they are saying, the Commonwealth, yes, but let it concentrate on economic development. Let it concentrate on entrepreneurial skills development. Well, all of those things are important. But they're saying it's the things that earn money and the things that are budget dominated. But just think of the implications of this. Education, we don't need to support education across the Commonwealth. Health, how much more of a priority can you have on that? But that's where they've been trying to cut the budget. And there's been a very strong defense of keeping health and education in the funding, in the Commonwealth's activities, in their work plans, in their triennium future planning. And the champions, the ministers that have been disagreeing with the richer countries that are trying to save the money, have been small states. The last Commonwealth CCEM, Commonwealth Education Ministers meeting, was actually held nearby in 2012 in Mauritius. And I was fortunate, because of this work, we were reporting these findings back to that Commonwealth Ministers meeting. So, of course, I had the pass, the badge, and I could sit in the meetings. I could sit in closed meetings with ministers. We have a huge table, you know. You have your nameplate for a minister for Swaziland or whatever. If you want to speak, you stand it up on end like that. The big funding nations, and that means, unfortunately, the UK, it means Australia, it means Canada, were arguing for cuts, cuts, cuts. And then suddenly it's... And the nation's ministers, this is the ministers at the table, I'm sitting in a corner somewhere, the back of the room, but it was the ministers from small states that were saying, we must fight to keep education and health in the bag, in the package. And, of course, they are able to say, this is a Commonwealth meeting. The small states are the majority of Commonwealth member states. That's a hard one for the critics to disagree with. And to date, they've held the cause. Education is still funded as a separate activity within the Commonwealth Secretariat. But the battle's shaky. If you guys don't know that, you might be able to lobby and join in through your own ministers, through your own influence. Number 5, then, it's a little bit more about this international support, how important that is, collaboration, and we're trying to work together. Those of us that are working through my visit here, your Vice-Chancellor, your Deputy Vice-Chancellors, other people within the ministries, we're trying to see if there's ways that we can keep collaborative research moving around the priorities that are Maldives priorities, by Maldives researchers. But the international connections can help and can support, and we hope we can make something of that out of the visit. So we're saying international support is strategically important. It needs consolidating. We need to work hard for this. So I'm coming to some conclusions. Those were the findings of the study. And you can read it in this book, and I will leave this copy. It'll be one of a little package of things that I'll leave to say thank you. Or you can get it from the Commonwealth Secretariat if you go on their website, if you wish to get a copy yourself. But we are coming to some broader conclusions, and I'm wearing my Professor of Comparative Education hat a little bit with these. But we're saying that small states have very distinctive needs and priorities, and they often differ from the dominant global international agendas and targets. That doesn't mean to say small states should reject those international targets and goals, but it should engage with the process of them. It should push the boundaries. It should try to pull the international community to support what they believe are the priorities in education. And then more broadly, and this is probably just illustrates the step that a doctoral researcher certainly has to do. Your conclusions as doctoral researchers can't be just about the place you've studied, Maldives or Papua New Guinea. It's got to feed back to the international literature. Well, here's just one little example. This work on small states really does help to highlight how development agencies, researchers, policymakers must give increased attention to differences in context. And you can interpret context in many ways. It could be cultural context. It could be religious context. It could be economic, financial, it could be intellectual context. It could be historical. But certainly I would say when you're doing your research, when you're involved in policy deliberations and discussions, do keep that at the back of the mind. What are our real needs here? Does this American model that's really powerful fit our needs, our culture, our context? We have to mediate it. We have to get hold. We might have to challenge it. We might agree. We might want it. But we've got to think of it in those terms.